Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, books, and popular culture. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the program. My name is Bruce Markison. As always, I'm joined by producer and co-host Tracy Asteria. Tracy, welcome to you. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Bruce. How's everything going with you?
Well, as you know, I'm coming off a sleepless night. We had my daughter's project prom event here in Cooperstown. So my wife and I were at this event from 7 p.m. last night till almost 6 o'clock this morning. Didn't get to bed until probably about 6:30. So I apologize ahead of time to our guest coming up if I doze off during the program. It's not because I'm not riveted by what you have to say. It's because of other factors. I don't think that's going to happen.
Oh, my goodness.
So now that we've scared off our guest, we'll tell you more about him in a moment. You have some horror news, though, that you want to tell us about first, Tracy. What's going on?
I do. I have a little bit of new horror industry news that I just read about.
Okay.
So you remember that you and we discussed Maggie Gyllenhaal's project, The Bride, on a previous episode. Yeah. And this piece obviously will pay tribute to the original film, The Bride of Frankenstein. And the film stars Christian Bale as the monster. You have Penelope Cruz and Annette Bening and Peter Skarsgård, just to name a couple of people. But it was just reported the other day that her brother, Jake Gyllenhaal, is actually joining the cast as well. Oh. And I thought that was kind of fascinating because when we talked about it previously, I think it was kind of up in the air, and I believe he wasn't going to be a part of this project. But he's since changed his mind, and I think the film is in production, and there is an actual release date of October 3rd, 2025 for that film. So, I thought that was an interesting read and wanted to share that with everybody.
Yeah, he's a very good actor, brand name actor. He was great in a movie I've really come to like, even though it's kind of depressing, The Day After Tomorrow. But he plays kind of the lead protagonist. He's the son of the character played by Dennis Quaid. And he's done some other horror films as well. There was a film that he did years ago about kind of a giant monster rabbit. For some reason, the title is eluding me, but that was a film that drew some interest and has remained pretty popular as a streaming alternative. So yeah, he's quality actor. That'd be a great addition to the cast.
Absolutely.
Very good. So more on that Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein film. Anything with Christian Bale figures to be pretty darn good. And the Gyllenhaals, both good actors as well. Well, Tracy, this week we have the return to the show of writer, blogger, and horror film historian Dan Day. Dan writes the Hitless Wonder movie blog. For many years, he has attended the annual Monster Bash conference in Pennsylvania, planning to do so again this year. And at Monster Bash, Dan has gotten to know a number of actors and actresses, really knows a ton about the history of horror. Dan, welcome back to the Ghostly Gallery. Great to have you on again.
Thanks. It's great to be back here. I obviously didn't screw things up the first time because you asked me back, so...
Yeah, we didn't have to delete any of your comments, nothing like that.
Good. Especially in this day and age.
Yeah. Do you remember the name of that movie I'm talking about? Jake Gyllenhaal and the Monster Rabbit? Does that ring a bell for you?
I have no idea. When I think of Monster Rabbits, I automatically think of Night of the Lepus. So,
yeah,
right.
I don't think it was in that one. That was early 1970s. So.
Oh yeah. That's a pretty awful movie. This one was a lot better, even though it sounds crazy with the monster rabbit. Maybe the name of it will come to me.
Would it be Donnie Darko?
That's
Bruce?
it. Yes,
Donnie
Darko.
Okay,
yes.
There we go.
Very good.
I love Google. Google's my friend.
Donnie Darko. That's right. And that's interesting. Donnie Darko, D.D., Dan Day, D.D. That's a coincidence right there. Did not plan that.
June 6th was a couple days ago. Of course, I have absolutely nothing in common with the brave men who did what they did on June 6th. So I just want to put that out there before anybody, anybody thinks I'm trying to take advantage of D-Day. I'm not, trust me.
Yeah, that was amazing. I saw some of the ceremony from Normandy. Pretty stirring to watch that, to see what these men did 80 years earlier. Just incredible. Well, in today's episode, we'll talk about something quite a bit less serious, but something that is an enjoyable topic. We're going to talk to Dan about the horror classics from Universal Studios. Now, the last time Dan joined us, the show pretty much concentrated on Hammer films, which is a strong area of interest for Dan. But he also informed me after that show that he really loves the Universal Studios classic films from the 1930s. For many fans, these are the films that really form the basis for their love of the genre. And I think they've created a standard by which we tend to judge other films that have come from later eras. We're going to tackle 9 of the films. We don't have time to tackle all of them, but we picked 9 that we think are either the best or maybe the most interesting to talk about. So, Dan, we're going to begin with a film that really started this new horror era of the 1930s. And that, of course, is 1931's Dracula. It's a film that is choppy, it's poorly edited, lacks much in the way of a musical score, has virtually no special effects, but somehow, Dan, it does remain critically important, I think, for a couple of reasons. I want to get your thoughts on it as well. First, you have Bela Lugosi's performance, which is iconic, but also because it's a film that showed that horror could sell in the theater. It was a tremendous box office success for Universal. Why do you think Dracula is so important? Is it for those reasons or others?
Well, I have to agree with what you just said. I also believe that at the time, in America at least, that was one of the few films, or one of the first films, where you did actually have a supernatural creature, and it wasn't explained in the end as somebody dressing up in a costume or somebody pulling some kind of a prank or somebody, using the guise of a supernatural creature to commit a crime. Dracula's a vampire. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no explanation at the end. There's no, it was all a dream. There's something, the guy's crazy. He is an actual vampire. That was extremely rare back in those days. Todd Browning himself had directed a number of films that you can't really say are out and out horror films. They're more, I guess, creepy, bizarre tales with Lon Chaney Sr. And he actually worked with Bela Lugosi before in a film called The 13th Chair, which is basically more of a murder mystery, very early talkie, and that's very creaky as well. But I think the thing about Dracula, you're talking about some of its deficiencies. I will say the recent Blu-ray re-release or the restoration of Dracula, the film looks and sounds much, much better. It plays a lot better. I remember seeing it on TV various times, like starting in the 1980s. Svengoolie, of course, I got to mention Svengoolie. He shows it at least maybe once a year. And back then it was like very, very choppy, and it didn't look or sound. It always had this kind of hiss in the background, like somebody left the air conditioner on. And what Universal has done, and they've done what all these films that we're going to talk about tonight, Universal has remastered and restored these and put them out on Blu-ray, and they all look and sound magnificent. And I think that's great because a lot of people, horror film fans, they sometimes look down on the early classics, the early 1930s classics. Oh, it's in black and white. It doesn't sound good. It doesn't look good. You can't make that case nowadays.
That's a great point. It really is. Of course, Lugosi's performance is stunning to us now, and it must have been particularly remarkable to theater goers back in 1931. Dan, do you think anybody has matched Lugosi or even come close to matching his performance as Dracula since then?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously you have Christopher Lee. It's hard for me to say one is better than the other, especially with a character like Dracula, because there's been so many different interpretations of the role. I think you have to put Lugosi and Lee up at the top. One thing, when you told me we're going to be discussing these films, I'm thinking, God, so many people like Greg Mank and Frank Dello Stritto and just so many experts, way more intelligent, way more, sophisticated than I am, have gone over these films over and over again. What more can I say about them? One thing I'll point out is Lugosi almost didn't get the part at all.
Yeah.
At that point, he had played the role on stage on Broadway, but as for like being a known figure, especially in Hollywood, he was not. And if you look at some of the books that have been written about the production by people like David J. Skall, Gary Rhodes, it was almost Universal was trying to find anybody but Lugosi for whatever reason. They didn't want to use him. I think a lot of it was he was a Hungarian. He was not generally known to American audiences at the time. They wanted someone that was, more, I guess, maybe more mainstream, because you have to remember this type of film with a supernatural creature wasn't being made at the time. So Universal was actually kind of taking a big risk with this, especially during the Depression.
Yeah.
So using someone like Lugosi, I think actually is that was a major risk. And of course, now you can't think of anybody but Lugosi as that Dracula. I mean, film geeks like to do the what if game. What if it had been this actor? What if it had been that actor? You could do that all day long, but the fact is, it's Lugosi. And if you do a Lugosi impression among little kids, they know you're doing a vampire. They know you're doing Dracula, which is amazing. 90 years on, when these little kids they have no idea who Bela Lugosi is. But if you do a Lugosi impression, everybody knows what you're doing. Which that kind of pop culture impression is still amazing when you think about it.
One of the great things about that is it's easy to do that voice and make it sound reasonably good, but he was the guy who started it. Nobody had done it before.
Oh, yeah.
And so he really created that, and that has become such an iconic thing. It's hard to imagine any of the other first choices that Universal had could have matched or succeeded Lugosi in terms of his impact. So it turned out to be a stroke of fortune. Dan, in addition to Lugosi as Dracula, you have another great performance turned in by an actor who doesn't always get recognition, and that's Dwight Frye.
Oh, yeah.
Who portrays the psychotic Renfield, and in many ways, he's just as good. He's got his laugh down.
No, he's the thing about Dwight Frye is, when he was alive, he was constantly, complaining about the roles he had to play. But why do we remember him now? It's because of the roles that he played. I mean, you kind of feel sorry for the guy because that's not what he wanted to do. If you see photographs of him in his normal guise and normal clothes, I mean, he looks, very much like a decent gentleman. And apparently on stage, he was a light comedic actor. He even did some romantic roles, which is hard to believe. But I mean, he, as Renfield, I mean, you can't match him. And there's been plenty of other Renfields by all sorts of different, once again, just like Dracula, so many people have interpreted that role. But yeah, it's Dwight Frye all the way. I mean, he's just, he's amazing in that film.
Tragic story. He was only 31 when he appeared in Dracula. And then later that year, he would appear as Fritz, the hunchbacked assistant to Dr. Frankenstein in the movie that we're going to talk about in a moment. And then sadly, just 12 years later, he died from a heart attack. He had just signed on to do a non-horror film. He was really trying to kind of resuscitate his career, get away from these creepy Renfield and Fritz type roles. And here in his early 40s, he was gone. And maybe that's another reason why he's not as well remembered, but certainly had a huge impact on this film. Maybe not as much as Lugosi, but in terms of the amount of screen time per minute, he I think did match Lugosi as far as a memorable performance. So Dan, that brings us to our second film from 1931. It's a much more polished film that came from Universal in the form of their original version of Frankenstein. It's my personal favorite among all the Universals. Curious, what do you think the reaction might have been from theater goers when they first saw Boris Karloff on the screen as Frankenstein on the big screen? I mean, we see him all these years later. It's powerful. I imagine back then, some people might have been running out of the theater.
Oh, I totally agree. One of the things I was actually going to bring up during this talk, I'm trying to figure out how can I, talk about these films that have been discussed so many different times, is we almost kind of take these films for granted now. And a lot of younger people or people watch them for the first time, they kind of look at them and like, well, that's it. Why are these things such a, well, once again, you have to put it into context. You didn't have movies with supernatural creatures at that time. And remember, this was the beginning of sound, which made things more realistic, more, morose, I guess you could say. And sound is used very, very well by James Whale in that film. James Whale, I think, was a far better filmmaker than Todd Browning was. Obviously, the Frankenstein has a much better flow to it overall. Yeah, seeing Karloff in that makeup for the first time must have been insane, because the makeup, it does not look like, I mean, obviously it's a makeup, but it doesn't look like a makeup is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't look contrived or fake or phony. Right. I mean, there were a lot of people back then who probably thought, this is a real dead guy. Because remember, in the credits at the beginning, the monster, I think he's credited with a question mark.
Right.
And of course, I'm sure people realize, well, yeah, it's an actor, but I mean, the effect of that must have been amazing. You hear the stories about how theater owners were getting calls in the middle of the night that people had seen the movie were so angry, I can't sleep, so I'm going to make sure you don't sleep either, and things like that. And Universal getting, all these telegrams and people complaining, but at the same time, it made Universal and the theater owners realize what a sensation this film was.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is that you could have imagined seeing somebody like that walking down the street.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been that's somewhat realistic.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what makes these makeups by Jack Pierce. We got to mention Jack Pierce. These makeups and the way the monsters in these films look, the iconography of these films is so potent, and that's what makes them live on 90 years later, and why CGI can never, ever, ever, top that, because it's Karloff, it's Lugosi, or either it's Chaney Jr. or it's Elsa Lanchester. There's somebody real in there, and you can tell that, and they're giving a real performance. And that's why the iconography of these figures are never going to die. They're just going to live on forever, because there's something just so powerful about that.
Flattened head, the scar on the forehead, the bolts coming out of the neck, the jacket with the sleeves that are too short, the thick boots that made Karloff seem so much taller than he actually was. That's the look.
Karloff was not, I think Karloff was maybe like 5'11". If you watch, like, say, The Black Cat or The Raven, you see a scene where Karloff and Lugosi are standing next to each other. Lugosi is taller than Karloff, and a lot of people don't believe that, but it's true. Lugosi was actually taller than Karloff, but because of that makeup and that costuming, the way they put him together. And speaking of the makeup, I do have to say, the makeup is iconic, but it worked best with Karloff. When you see somebody else in that makeup, Lon Chaney Jr., Glenn Strange, Lugosi, it still works, but it doesn't work as well with Karloff, in my opinion.
Yeah. It was a look that really suited him best of all. Dan, I want to get your thoughts on one of the most controversial scenes in the movie. It's the scene at the lake when the monster throws little Maria into the water. That was part of the original film that appeared in theaters, but then when it moved on to syndication, they actually took that out. And as it turned out, it in ways made the film even more horrific, because people wondered what exactly the monster did to Maria. In some ways, that was even more horrifying. I don't know if you remember the first time when you saw Frankenstein, but when you saw that scene with him throwing this tiny little girl into the water where she starts to drown, what was your reaction to it?
Well, I think the first time I saw Frankenstein, it was still the edited version. So you just see him moving toward her. Mm-hmm. You don't really know what happens. And like you said, that's actually more potent, I think, than when you see her throwing into it. It does look a bit kind of disjointed. I mean, and you can tell Karloff didn't want to do this. Yeah. Karloff was a very gentle man. You're dealing with I think she was like 7 years old. The little girl that her name escapes me, unfortunately, that was playing the role. Karloff and James Whale got in a huge argument about doing this, and Whale demanded that he do it. Yeah, it's a powerful scene, but it also shows the monster is essentially a child. He's less than a child. He's a baby. He's a newborn. Yeah. He doesn't really know what he's doing, and Karloff plays it that way. But once again, you have to take it into the context of the times. You're seeing a child being killed on screen, which even today is you very rarely see that, and it's shocking even today. And for a lot of people who are not film buffs who are friends of mine, well, how can you watch these black and white movies? They're so naive and they're so old fashioned. I'm like, no, they're not. You haven't really watched a lot of these things. There's a lot more going on to them than you think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. In Dracula, we don't see any young children that are being bitten or killed, but that certainly happens in Frankenstein. I think in a lot of ways, Frankenstein is a perfect film. It's my favorite from the Universal legacy. My only criticism of the film is its length, 71 minutes. Like a lot of movies from this era, they weren't that long, an hour, a little bit more. 71 minutes in retrospect is just a little bit too short. We would have liked to have seen, if they had such a thing back then, the extended director's cut.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand it. I mean, I'm the type of guy that, I have no problem with lengthy movies if there's a reason for them to be long. I think way too many movies nowadays in the 21st century just, they put in every single plot point. Every character has to have like a background story, and you don't really need that. What I love about older films is it allows the viewer to kind of fill in the blanks in your own head. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of movies, I think they're so scared of, what if the audience doesn't understand this? Well, you know what? You just have to go with it. And of course, back then in the 1930s, they didn't make 2.5 hour movies. I mean, I think maybe All Quiet on the Western Front, the original one, was like maybe 2.5 hours, but that was, an epic, novel adaptation. They weren't going to make horror movies any longer than that. I can understand your point, but I think also films in the 1930s, they went out of their way to make things more concise. They, because of the editing, and they were very concerned about the audience being bored. And you have to remember, when they showed those films, they didn't just show the film. You had like sometimes double features. You had like a comedy short subject. You had newsreels. So yeah, you may be seeing a 71-minute movie, but when you go to see the presentation of it, you're probably seeing like maybe almost like a half hour, an hour's worth of material before then. So I think that they were conscious of that as well.
Yeah, excellent point. Dan, next up on our list is one of 3 films from 1932. This one is maybe the least known of all the films we're going to talk about today, and that is Murders in the Rue Morgue. For those not familiar, here's the story of the film. So we have a movie set in 19th century Paris. We have a rather crazy doctor. I'm trying to remember the pronunciation. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Dr. Miracle.
Dr. Miracle.
Yeah.
Spelled Mirakle. Dr. Miracle is determined to prove a connection between ape and man by abducting innocent women and then injecting them with blood from a gorilla. So his experiments end up killing each of the women involved. When a young medical student learns that his girlfriend has been abducted by Dr. Miracle, he attempts to enlist the police to save her and bring the murderer to justice. Another film here where Lugosi plays the lead. He is the doctor and really stands out with his efforts.
Oh, yeah. I love his performance in this. I mean, this is like Lugosi to 11. I mean, he's just, he's by far the best thing about the film. There's this great scene where he's working in a circus, and he's showing off his ape. And actually he's doing this to, convince everybody of his theories of evolution. I mean, and of course, all these French people are coming in. They just want to see the ape. They don't care about, Lugosi's experiments or whatever, but he's giving his speech, and then behind him, there's this huge evolution chart, and Lugosi is underlit. He's got this curly hair. He's got this weird, like, unibrow. He's dressed in his black frock coat. I mean, and this speech is just incredible. It's one of the great Lugosi moments of all time. And yes, he's chewing the scenery, but that's what you want to see. That's what you want to see when you see a Bela Lugosi movie. You want to see him be Bela, and he's just absolutely loving it. I love his costuming. I love the way he acts in this film. He's just so crazy. It's wonderful. The sad thing about it is he's not really in the movie as much as he should be, unfortunately. The male and female lead in this film are very, very mediocre, as they sometimes are in these movies. And Bela is just so, he's just so over the top as Dr. Miracle and so creepy and so weird. To me, that Murders in the Rue Morgue, I think, deserves a bit more respect just for Lugosi's performance alone. And this was kind of a consolation prize for Robert Florey, who directed the film. He was originally supposed to direct Frankenstein, and Bela Lugosi was going to be the monster. And that would be an entire podcast. We could go on forever about what happened for that, but Florey got stuck with Murders in the Rue Morgue. Of course, Universal wanted to, because of the success of Dracula and Frankenstein, they wanted to continue this series. Obviously, what do we do next? Well, Edgar Allan Poe. That was his most famous story. It is actually kind of faithful to Poe in a lot of ways, but it in a lot of ways it isn't, kind of like the Roger Corman Poe movies, because every Poe story is only like about 10 or 15 pages long.
Yeah,
you really don't have much to work with if you're doing an entire script. But I think basically Florey just he just let Lugosi go, and Carl Freund was a cinematographer. It's very expressionistic, the photography and the art direction. If just the rest of the story, other than Lugosi, had been a little bit better or a bit more refined, I think it would have worked a lot better. But it's definitely worth seeing because of Lugosi's performance.
Yeah.
Okay.
What'd you think of Florey as a director? He didn't get the chance on Frankenstein, as you mentioned, and then tried to maybe make up for it here. Do you think he was a pretty decent director?
I think he was. I don't think he was in the class of James Whale. I've seen other Florey films. I think his most other famous film that people listening to this podcast will be familiar with is The Beast with Five Fingers with Peter Lorre, which is a pretty good film until the end, which it just kind of, falls apart, I think. I think Florey was a decent director. People talk about lost films or films that could have been. That's the one huge one, is what if Florey had directed Frankenstein with Lugosi as the monster? I don't think it would be anywhere near as iconic as what James Whale and Boris Karloff did. There's apparently they did a screen test with Lugosi in monster makeup, not the makeup that Karloff used, but in a sort of a pre-makeup, or what they were trying to figure out what to do, how to portray the monster. It was directed by Florey, and I think Edward Van Sloan and Dwight Frye was part of the test. And of course, the test is lost. I doubt anybody's ever going to find it. But people talk about London After Midnight. Oh my God, if they could find London After Midnight, which is true, that's like the holy grail of lost films. But if you could find that Frankenstein test, good God, that would be absolutely amazing to see what that would have been. Of course, it might have turned out to be a total joke as well. You never know, but.
Yeah, Lugosi supposedly hated the costuming, and that was, I guess, one of the reasons why he turned it down. When you look at Murders in the Rue Morgue, it's a controversial film. I mean, we've talked about this whole idea of injecting gorilla's blood into adult women and the effects that might have. Also, there was the inclusion of a prostitute in this movie. In the initial edit, the prostitute is shown being stabbed and then tied to cross beams, but censors said no, they were not going to permit it. So it did end up getting removed. So this was one of those pre-code movies that really kind of tested the limits.
Yeah, most of these great Frankenstein, these great Universal films we're talking about are, pre-code films where they could show a bit more. Perfect example, we talk about a child dying in the original Frankenstein, and how that, when the code was really starting to be enforced in, I think, late 1934, Universal had to, redo some things or rethink some things along the lines of the horror films. So the pre-code did give these films a bit more ghastlier than I think people expect, especially from our early 1930s black and white movie. And you have to remember evolution. I mean, evolution is still a touchy subject even today. So you can imagine what people thought back in the 1930s.
Yeah. Yeah, even before the code, some of the studios went a little bit too far, and the censors did sometimes step in. All right, Dan, another film from 1932. You think of a classic monster. The Mummy is certainly one of those. It's another starring vehicle for Karloff, but we see him only momentarily as the actual mummy wrapped in bandages. It's just instantaneous near the beginning of the film. Most of the time, we see him as this character, Ardolph Bey, a modern day Egyptian historian. And even though we don't see that much of the mummy in his wrappings, Ardolph Bey is pretty villainous in his own right.
Yeah, this is, of course, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this is a great film as well. Directed by Karl Freund, the great cinematographer. The Universal gave him a chance to direct, and I wish Universal had given him a lot more chances to direct. I think Karl Freund enjoyed being a cinematographer more. He was German, of course. He had his troubles and difficulties with the English language. I don't think he liked working with actors. If you know anything about the production, The Mummy, Zeta Johann, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. I'm probably not. Zeta Johann, who plays the female lead in The Mummy, she and Karl Freund did not get along at all. And but what Freud, who worked with Fritz Lang and a lot of the great German expressionist films, what he brought to this film was that silent German, creepy, macabre atmosphere. The Mummy almost plays like a silent film. It's very slow, but it's very creepy. It's very atmospheric. A lot of people have never seen the Karloff Mummy. When they first see it, they're kind of, where's the guy in the bandages running around killing people? Because they think of the Clarice movies with Lon Chaney Jr. This isn't, you can't even put those two in the same class. This is a totally different thing. But no, the Mummy is great. And as many writers have pointed out, the screenplay of The Mummy is actually kind of a remake of the Dracula screenplay, because you have Edward Van Sloan basically playing the same Van Helsing type of character. You have David Manners basically playing the same type of character. There's like character who's basically a Dr. Seward type. In both movies, the supernatural threat is trying to take over this beautiful young woman, to make her immortal, to join the supernatural threat and immortality. It has a lot of you can compare it in a lot of ways to the original Dracula, but it is, once again, it's a very slow film, but it's very creepy, very atmospheric. As long as you don't expect it to be a guy running around in bandages chasing people, then I think you'll enjoy it. To those who haven't seen it.
Yeah. Dan, you mentioned the problems between the director Freund and the leading lady Johann. I've read different theories about this. Some say that Freund was very abusive, didn't treat her with much respect. Others have said that Johann was a bit of a diva and that she maybe wasn't fully professional. Based on what you've read and heard, what's your feeling? I've always thought Freund was more the villain here in terms of the way he treated her. Others disagree. What do you think?
Well, I don't know, because, once again, this is like 90 years ago, and it's a he said, she said type of thing. It could have been a little bit of both. I think maybe it was more, Freund, being this German, may have not have been able to express himself well in English. Maybe he came off as a bit brusque to this young American actress who, maybe for whatever reason. I mean, you really don't know. It's one of those great legends of, in every one of these Universal movies that we're talking about, there's some sort of great legend or great, this is where somebody like Greg Mank, he's done his best work exploring these legends and delving into them and interviewing I believe Greg actually did interview Zeta Johann and interviewing these people and getting their perspectives on it. And it's a thing where I've read things about Karl Freund where people say, yeah, I worked with him. He was great. He was a wonderful guy. So, you don't know.
Interesting. One final question on this one. The makeup here is pretty remarkable. Even though we're not seeing it in terms of the bandaging, But when we see the character of Ardath Bey, he's sort of slowly degrading, deteriorating, and the amount of time put into doing that gradual effect must have been incredible.
Yeah, that's the other thing that's amazing about these films is the time it took to make up Karloff, either, whether it be this Frankenstein monster or the Mummy. The work that Jack Pierce did, it took hours and hours and hours. And once again, you have CGI nowadays, and people say, well, it'd be a lot easier to just do CGI. Yeah, it would, but when you do it that way, and I'm not saying that was the greatest thing in the world, because I think Karloff suffered physically and mentally from that. I mean, you can imagine having to show up at the studio at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and know I'm going to sit here in this chair for like 5 or 6 hours and I'm stuck and there's nothing I can do. And at the end of the day, I'm going to have to sit here for 5 or 6 hours again to take the makeup off. Then I got to go home, get whatever rest I can, go back the next morning and do it over again. I mean, Karloff did that for a majority of his career. And you can imagine, just the mental process you have to go through just to do that. I mean, for any actor, for what they had to put up with. And apparently from what I've read, Jack Pierce wasn't exactly the easiest guy to deal with either.
No.
Oh,
and you're dealing with techniques back in those days. I'm sure I'm no expert on this, but I'm sure makeup, the application of makeup is a bit more streamlined nowadays. I mean, back then it was literally they put stuff on your face, and if it didn't work, they would rip the stuff off and try something else. And the opening scenes of the Mummy where Karloff is in full mummy guise, that took absolutely forever. And he's only on screen in that costume. It's more than a costume. I mean, it's literally a transformation. He's only on screen for like a few seconds. The amount of time it took just to put that through, but that shows you what work went into these films.
Oh my gosh. Well, I read that, just for this movie that Karloff spent over 8 hours every day in that chair putting makeup on. And at the end of the day, after all the filming was done, it took over 2 hours for them to quote unquote melt off the makeup.
Yes.
And I can't even imagine, like I've seen interviews of makeup artists today that talked about some of their work, like maybe 15, 20 years ago. I can't even imagine what it would have been like back in the 30s, like just the chemicals in the makeup and just the process of, I don't even know what melting off the makeup would even involve, right?
and once Karloff had all that stuff on, whether he's the Frankenstein monster or the Mummy or Fu Manchu or whatever, he couldn't go to the bathroom. He couldn't eat. He couldn't, I think he could smoke a cigarette if somebody held it, to his mouth, but you have to be careful because some of that stuff was flammable.
Exactly.
I mean, it wasn't like, oh, Boris, you're not needed for the scene. You can go and relax now. Well, no, he can't, because he can't just, it's not like taking a coat off or taking a hat off. I mean, he's stuck in that makeup day after day after day.
That's right.
It's incredible and if you see Karloff when he's older in the 1960s, I mean, he's, a lot of times he's in a wheelchair because he had to be in a wheelchair. And a lot of times he's hobbling around. He's almost like totally bow-legged. And you can imagine the health and the back problems that he had his entire life from doing those films.
Well, another film where Karloff had to wear some makeup, not as much, is one of my favorites, also from 1932, The Old Dark House. Interesting. This at one time was believed to be a lost film. And then in 1968, a friend of the director, James Whale, found a print in the vaults of Universal Studios. He then turned it over to the George Eastman House for restoration. And thankfully, it's been in circulation ever since. It's gained a new level of appreciation. We've seen it on Svengoolie. Turner Classic Movies has had it. Many other outlets as well. When The Old Dark House first came out, it took some criticism, perhaps because it had a strong comedic feel to it. And I guess at times that overwhelms the horror. But that criticism, I guess, has dissipated over the years. Most horror fans that watch it now seem to enjoy the craziness of the film. I know that I do. What do you think, Dan? Is it too crazy or just the right amount of madness in The Old Dark House?
Well, I'm a James Whale fan to begin with. I think if you're a James Whale fan and you're familiar with his work, I think you'll totally buy into it. But it has that very weird, very unique English sense of humor. It's not an American sense of humor. It's an English kind of dry wit, kind of really weird. Ernest Thesiger is like the perfect example of that in The Old Dark House. Have a potato. Well, most people are like, what? But I mean, it's just that idiosyncratic James Whale type of feel to it. And I wouldn't even say it's even a horror film. It's more just like a weird, bizarre adventure that these stranded travelers have. They wind up with this weird femme family in this weird house, and they're stuck there. You have all these eccentric characters, and Charles Laughton shows up, and of course he's going to be eccentric no matter what. And Karloff isn't really in the film very much. I mean, he gets top billing, and you look at the posters, his huge face, and he's made up as Morgan, the mute butler. And of course, they say, don't give him anything to drink. Don't give him any drink. And of course, he gets drunk. We all know what that's going to happen. But he really doesn't have all that much to do in the film. And I think some people, when they see it, if they're not into James Whale, they don't really understand his type of humor and his type of filmmaking. They probably look at it and, well, where's Karloff? Karloff isn't really what you would call a villain in this either.
Yeah.
The real villain is somebody that isn't revealed until the end of the film, and he's like this short, skinny, nerdy looking guy, which is actually pretty good for the story. But I think when a lot of people, when they see The Old Dark House for the first time, especially modern audiences, they're kind of disappointed because they want to see Karloff, and they want to see all the Universal the expected Universal monster stuff, and that's not really what this film was about.
Yeah. I do have to say though, Dan, I love the scene when he gets drunk, he goes into the kitchen and just starts flailing around, throwing dishes, breaking everything in sight, no rhyme or reason. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was like, I think maybe, for all I know, Universal probably told James, well, Karloff's got to do something. Okay. Somebody at Universal, the Lemleys or somebody probably told James, well, look, if you're going to have Karloff in this movie, he's got to, destroy something or get in a fight with somebody. So I think that was almost kind of like added in there, so to speak.
Yeah. Is your favorite character Ernest Thesiger's Horace Femme? He certainly is my favorite character in the film.
Yeah. He's great. And of course, we'll be talking about a certain other film where we definitely have to talk about him. But there's all sorts of eccentric characters and performances in this. And like I said, a lot of people who are not used to that kind of offbeat English, quixotic humor, they're just not going to get, they just won't get into it.
Yeah.
A lot of famous names in this film. Melvin Douglas is in this film, one of his earliest films. Gloria Stewart, who of course is known now for Titanic. She's in this movie. Raymond Massey is in the film. It actually has more of and Charles Laughton, as I said, it actually has more of a mainstream type cast, a much bigger cast than most of those Universal horror films of the time would have.
This was the first film I saw with Gloria Stewart after seeing her in Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
And, to see someone at the two extremes of their life, beautiful youth, and then, very much aging, even though a well-liked character in Titanic, and to think, this is the same person. It's a reminder of humanity to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You mentioned before the true villain, who we don't see until really the last act of the movie. The character that they're told we can't let him out. He's very crazy and dangerous. And boy, he turns out to be exactly that. I don't think he's out for 5 minutes, and he starts setting the house on fire.
Yeah, I know. I love the way Whale sets it up, because you've heard about this guy the whole movie. When he's finally revealed, like I said, I cannot remember the actor's name. I'm sorry, but I think he's like 5'5", and he looks like, just some harmless guy. And at first he acts harmless, like, oh, they locked me up for no reason. They're going to kill me. Then you start to see it in his eyes and the way Whale directs it, the camera angles that he uses, and how he makes the camera angles closer and closer as the scene goes on between this actor and Melvin Douglas. And you start to realize, this guy is crazy. He is the crazy one. He's the one they need to worry about. The way it's done, I think, is magnificent. And it's a prime example of James Whale's directorial talent.
even though it's not, as you say, a true horror movie. Are you a fan of this one?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I'm a huge James Whale fan. I think sometimes his idiosyncrasies do have a tendency to take over the film, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about that later on about another film. But no, I think he has this very unique style, and it makes these films. It gives these films more of a life than they probably would had if somebody else had directed this type of story.
Next up from 1933, another true classic, The Invisible Man. Now, for most of the film, we only hear the voice of Claude Rains as the title character, Dr. Jack Griffin. And I think really this is a tribute to Rains' skill as an actor. He has to rely on his voice, which was a remarkable voice, and literally kills it in this role.
Oh yeah, I mean, I believe he might have appeared in a couple silent movies in England. I'm not sure about that, but I think this is like his debut role in America. And for someone that had never been in a Hollywood film, I mean, yes, we only hear his voice, but he is on screen a lot of time. He's just covered up. But it's an absolutely magnificent performance because he's not just his voice, but his body language as well. Because obviously you can't see his face, so he is. I mean, Rains is one of my favorite actors of all time, not just for The Invisible Man, but just for so many, great performances throughout his career. And since I'm talking about Rains, I might as well give a shout out to Monster Bash this summer. Claude Rains' daughter is going to be one of the guests at the July Monster Bash.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Jessica Rains. But yeah, Rains is magnificent. The way he uses his body is even the moon's afraid of me. I mean, he's just so out there. But you realize that his brain has been transmuted by him turning invisible. What turns him invisible also drives him insane.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is interesting about The Invisible Man is Rains is technically the villain, but in a way, James Whale sets it up so you're actually rooting for him because he's by far the most charismatic and most dynamic character in the film. All the other characters in the film are just either busybodies or they just look ridiculous. And that's Whale's sense of humor, but Rains is like he's basically the hero of the film.
Also, he's quite brutal in The Invisible Man.
Yes.
He murders at least 4 people on screen. Then he derails a train which is full of innocent passengers.
Mm-hmm.
And although they don't really, show that as graphically as we would see it today, it's still
you can fill in the blanks in your mind. But like I said, even though he does all that, and you're very aware of that, it's obvious James Whale is rooting for Claude Rains. James Whale is setting everything up that Claude Rains is the main star of this film. There's another character, I cannot remember the character's name, but he's basically kind of Rains' rival for the leading lady, which is played by Gloria Stewart. And this character he's kind of like the David Manners role. But this character, he's a coward, he's a hypocrite, he's totally unlikable, and James Whale goes out of his way to portray him as totally unlikable, even though he's supposed to be on the good guy's side. He's supposed to be trying to stop the Invisible Man. Every time I see this movie, I mean, you want the Invisible Man to get away and to take this guy out, and that's basically what he does.
One other question on this movie, and you'll pardon my dog Salem barking in the background. Big fan of The Invisible Man, I should mention. It's interesting. This is a film that comes from the famous H.G. Wells book, The Invisible Man. And I have to admit, I've never read this classic piece of fiction, which is a failing on my part. Have you ever read the book, Dan?
Yeah, I read it back when I was in high school. There was a period in high school where I just started reading like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Asimov, all the great science fiction and horror writers, H.P. Lovecraft. I probably got I think I had like a Barnes and Noble version of like the great novels of H.G. Wells where they have like 4 or 5 of them in a big hardcover. I got it, somewhere, but I haven't read it in a while. But what I do remember, it basically, it's very much like the movie, except there's no romantic interest whatsoever. But there's a lot of it, it does have the basic story is there, and of course Universal had to put in a romantic interest. So,
do you recommend the book? It's
oh
it's
yeah,
always been
yeah,
mentioned as a classic.
I'd recommend any of those original H.G. Wells novels.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would be surprised because now it's like with Jules Verne. People think, well, yeah, I know all these stories because you've seen all the movie adaptations, and you read the novels, and you realize there's a lot more going on there than people realize.
Yeah. All right. Next up, we have a film from 1934, entertaining movie and really an important piece of film history because it gives us Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi on screen together for the first time. I'm talking about the classic The Black Cat, again from 1934. What do you think of the tension between Karloff's and Lugosi's characters here? There's been a lot said about real life tension. Whether that has been exaggerated or not, there's no question about the tension of their characters, and that's really one of the pervading themes here.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was obvious for Universal to put Karloff and Lugosi together, and obviously you're going to have them, fighting or against each other. I mean, that's a given, and they're great in the movie. This is a very strange Black Cat is very, very strange, very, very pre-code. There's no way they could have made this movie like a year or so, and apparently there was stuff cut out of it that didn't even make it back then. Edgar G. Ulmer was the director. He wound up basically directing all sorts of B movies like Detour later on in the 40s and 50s. He basically got kicked out of Universal because I believe he had an affair with one of the Universal executives' wives. And I think that Universal executive was Carl Laemmle's nephew or cousin, because everybody in Universal was related to Carl Laemmle. So needless to say, he crossed the family. So he basically got blackballed from major Hollywood. Ulmer has this huge cult reputation. I have to say that I think he's sometimes overrated. A lot of his B movies and cheaper science fiction movies just, to me, are not as great as people say they are. I think here there's all sorts of like weird, strange stuff going on in this film. The design of Karloff's house, his manor, which is very Art Deco, very modern, very sleek, very light, and not anything like you consider a Gothic castle or something that in evil a Satanist like Karloff's character would be living in. Then you get down in the basement and you find out he's got this basement filled with women in glass cases that he's preserved. It's like really weird, bizarre film.
Yeah, I mean, the things that are portrayed here, there's black magic, there's devil worship. You've got a scene where a key character is skinned alive.
Mm-hmm.
This was very controversial. Censors in at least 3 different countries banned it from being shown. You mentioned that it was pre-code, so that allowed it to be made. But I don't know, when I first saw it, I was shocked. I was like, even pre-code, this is a film that it's pretty amazing what they got away with.
Yeah. It's you're dealing with Satanists, and even pre-code, Satanists. That was something major Hollywood studios didn't want to. And apparently, I believe this film did not make a lot of money, and Universal wasn't. Of course, like I said, Edgar G. Ulmer's personal life had something to do with it, but Universal wasn't too happy with how the movie came out, and they weren't too happy with some of the things that was going on with it that Ulmer put into it. Apparently, it's if you watch the movie, there's a lot of story elements that just don't fit together. It's one of those movies where if you look back and you say, why did that happen? How come this, a lot of random stuff going on. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that they cut things out of it. But, and of course it has the fantastic sequence of Karloff and Lugosi playing chess with each other for the lives of the young couple, which is the ultimate Karloff and Lugosi scene, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And the famous line of dialogue where David Manners says something like, "Oh, that's a bunch of baloney and superstition, perhaps baloney, perhaps not."
Tracy, you made a point of watching the film earlier this week. I think you wanted to ask Dan about it too.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like more of a comment because honestly, I didn't know what to expect with this movie. I knew it was pre-code, so I knew it would be kind of a little bit more dicey than what I would be used to seeing for a period of like that time. Um, there was just like so much stuff I didn't expect. You had mentioned the deceased ladies in like the glass trophy cases. When I first saw it, like the movie was a little bit grainy. I had to stop it and go back. And it was like, did I really see what I think I just saw? Like, are those women dead in trophy cases? And sure enough, they were. And I was just kind of like, I probably sat there with my mouth open, like, wow, that's crazy. And just kind of like the satanic worshiping piece. Um, it was kind of frightening. And I can't imagine what people in the 30s, would have thought about that aspect because I wouldn't think it would be a popular subject back then. I wouldn't think.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, considering 1930s, say somebody, I live in Indiana. You imagine if somebody in 1930s Indiana went to the theater and oh, it's Karloff and Lugosi movie. Let's see what those guys are up to. And they were like, what the heck? I mean, so I think what Universal wanted, they wanted a Karloff and Lugosi movie. They wanted the name of Edgar Allan Poe to be involved, although Edgar Allan Poe has nothing to do with this film whatsoever. If he was around, he'd be suing everybody. But they got a lot more than what they expected. I guess they could say.
Yeah, The Black Cat, 1934. All right, Dan, we've got two more movies to talk about. Both came out in 35. The first one in April of that year, and that's The Bride of Frankenstein. Many have called it the jewel of Universal's horror universe. We see more of Karloff as the monster here than in the first movie. We're also introduced to the character of Dr. Praetorius, played by the aforementioned Ernest Thesiger. You obviously were strongly influenced by what Thesiger did here. Do you think he really steals the movie?
I do.
Yeah.
I absolutely love this film. It's one of my 10 favorite films of all time. It's an amazing film. It's more than a horror film. It's almost, you can't even really classify it because it's just so unique and it's just so individual in the way it is. It's basically like a storybook fantasy in a way. It's very weird. It's very funny. It's very quixotic. It has that strange, weird James Whale vibe, but it's also very moving as well because you're dealing with what the monster goes through, the fact that he's, totally alone in the universe. The ending of the film, the monster speaks, which Karloff did not want, but actually it's one of the more powerful things in the film. Karloff cries. It's just an amazing film. There's just so many things in it that, I could spend a whole hour just talking about Bride of Frankenstein. It's an amazing production.
Yeah. Did you agree with Whale's decision to have the monster speak?
I do, because, the thing about sequels, and that definitely goes in today, you can either do one where the character just does the exact same thing as they did before, or you can expand on the character to do different things with the character. And I think Whale understood that's what you had to do with the monster, because the monster in a way is kind of a one-note character. And unfortunately, that's how he wound up in the 1940s Universal films. He's just, kind of there and he's stumbling around and that's it. Whale knew that there were things you could do with this monster and his plight and his situation, and you could make him sympathetic to the public. And once again, Whale has a way of, when he makes these horror films, he has a way of making you sympathetic, or at least interested in the plight of the characters that you would consider to be the villains or the bad guys. Yeah. I think Whale was a gay man. I think most people know that. And I think you can read way too much into that when you watch these films. I think a lot of people do, but you have to look at his personal situation and realize he may have had a different way of thinking about certain people and in these films. And that's why these films come out the way they do. There's nothing really mainstream about Whale's films.
Elsa Lanchester is on screen as the bride for only a couple of minutes at the very end, but her appearance is so striking that we can't get it out of our minds.
Oh yeah.
In retrospect, Dan, do you think Wales should have given us more of the bride?
No, I think the way they use her works perfectly because that her makeup and her performance is so striking that if you spent more and more time on it, I think it would dilute it. It would just the impact of it would be diluted. It's I think the last time I was on the show, we were talking about Hammer Films. We were talking about Christopher Lee's Dracula and how he had very little screen time. And I compared him to Darth Vader. And I think this is another example of that. You have such a striking, powerful character that if you'd given her more and more screen time, I think that would have watered it down. The fact that we don't get a lot of her makes her even more. You want to know more about, what was the bride thinking? Well, obviously we know what she was thinking. I mean, she screams at Karloff first time she sees him. But to me, I think the way Whale did it and the way he directed it with the weird angles and the Franz Waxman's Franz Waxman's musical score, which is one of the greatest musical scores of all time. And one of the very first scores, which was entirely, goes throughout the entire film. They very rarely did that back in those days. And he keeps up this heartbeat, boom, boom, boom during the whole creation sequence of the bride. It's just absolutely amazing.
So Dan, this is your favorite of all the 1930s Universal horror classics?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Bride of Frankenstein. That's a good choice. All right, one more film to talk about, also from 1935, came out in the summer in July. And The Raven. This is perhaps Lugosi's most maniacal performance ever. Boy, he makes Dracula seem like the Tooth Fairy.
Yeah. This is why I wanted to talk about it, because I'm not one of these people that prefer Karloff or Lugosi. You can enjoy both. It's like arguing about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. You can appreciate both of their careers. You don't have to say one's better than the other, or I like this one guy better than the other guy. You could appreciate both, but Lugosi very rarely got a chance to, shall we say, outdo Karloff in their films together. And this is definitely a Lugosi film. Karloff gets main billing, but this is by far a Lugosi film. And just like Murders in the Rue Morgue, this is Lugosi by 11. If you're a Lugosi fan, you absolutely love it because he just totally dominates the movie. And he is just so whacked out crazy. He's Dr. Valen, a renowned surgeon who is obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe and has all these recreations of Poe's torture devices and Poe's stories in his basement. And the guy is absolutely nuts. He's obsessed with a young woman whose life he saved. And he winds up getting the young woman and her boyfriend and various friends and family members over to his manor one weekend, which, when you think about it, why would anybody spend a night in this guy's manor for any reason whatsoever? And he basically tries to force this young woman to, come into his clutches. And it's just a wild, crazy mess of a film. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's one of these films where if you really examine it, it's like, it makes no sense whatsoever, but it's just great because of Lugosi's performance.
Our friend Gregory Mank, whom you've mentioned a couple of times, said that critics really railed about the sadism, the torture, the ugliness of the movie. In some ways, it's kind of amazing that it was even made. It was 1935. Would this have been pre-code or post-code?
I think this was after pre-code, and I totally agree with you, Ed. I'm surprised that this movie was able to get out the way it did and not really be cut. I mean, you don't really see anybody get killed on screen. It's not like gory or bloody. They didn't do things back in those days, but there's a lot of like very bizarre, weird stuff. And I don't know if I know a lot of critics didn't like it. I don't know if just the censors, just for whatever reason, they just didn't catch it or they weren't paying attention, or maybe because of the Edgar Allan Poe thing, they just didn't, they thought, oh, this is just classic literature, even though once again, this has nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah. Final question on this one. A little surprising to me that it did not do well at the box office, because it is, I think, even though it is a crazy movie, it's entertaining. We see what Lugosi can do when he's given free rein. You surprised that it didn't produce better numbers at the box office?
Yeah, I wonder because by that time, 1935, remember, it wasn't just Universal making horror films. I mean, everybody, every studio was getting on the bandwagon. And I think there may have been just a glut of these things. And there were so many of these things made in such a short period of time. It's kind of like comic book movies of today. I think it just got to a point where people were just, and there was kind of a backlash from a lot of, people, a lot of, certain cities, especially in the rural areas, to these films, because a lot of people just thought these films were, absolutely terrible. Like people complaining about video games or movies of today.
So I have a question for you. Just on the whole aspect of all of these Universal movies, what are your thoughts about some of these absolute classics being remade? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with that, or would you prefer that you just leave those classics alone?
Well, it's not up to me to decide whether somebody, wants to make I'm certainly not going to put any inhibitions on any sort of creative person. I understand, if you remake a film or remake a story, especially if it's a novel or a short story, everybody has their own different interpretations of it. I think sometimes some of these remakes, they seem to go out of their way to go totally beyond what the story was originally, just for the purpose of doing that, I guess is the best way I can explain it. I basically have grown up with these films. If you're a film geek, the 1930s Universal series, it's kind of like, the Beatles discography, or the 27 New York Yankees, or the 75, 76 Cincinnati Reds. I mean, these are movies that, like I said earlier, it's almost gotten to the point where people take these movies for granted. And I think, some people say, well, a remake will cause people to seek out the original one, which may happen or occur sometimes. Once again, you're also dealing with characters like Frankenstein and Dracula, or whether it be a werewolf or Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, these are iconic characters and iconic stories that they're going to be remade over and over again for whatever generation, decides to go that way. I can totally understand people who don't get into black and white films, or are not happy because there's so much politically incorrect stuff from the 21st century point of view. It doesn't bother me, but there are people that are bothered by that, and they think that somehow, well, I can do this story in a different way. I say, more power to them. I mean, once again, I hate putting any type of rules or anything on creativity. So I'm not the biggest remake fan in the world, but it's not up to me to say, oh, you can't do that.
Right. And just one more question that I have for you. Are you looking forward to any of the new movies that are coming out later this year? Or have you seen something recently that just blew your socks off?
I mean, just horror wise, or just in general, or
your choice?
Honestly, there's not. It's weird because I live near South Bend, and there's not really a lot of theaters available. There's a town next to South Bend is Mishawaka. East of Mishawaka is a town called Elkhart. And in Elkhart, Indiana, the last theater in Elkhart actually closed down not too long ago. And Elkhart is not exactly a small town. It's amazing that a town of that size would not have a movie theater. And when you're dealing with an area that doesn't have like a big city, unfortunately, what theaters you have basically just show you the mainstream stuff. A lot of things I have to go see on streaming. Unfortunately, I don't like doing that. Right. But it's just, and I don't think it's just South Bend. I think there's a lot of areas around America where you just can't see lower budget films or independent films like you used to. You have to kind of, look out for them. Right. I will say, I was very, very impressed by Dune, by both parts 1 and 2 of Dune. I saw it in the theater, but like I said, honestly, a lot of these lower budget horror or science fiction films, they're never shown in theaters in my area.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know. That's kind of the same way here where I'm from. I've had to pick a lot of new movies up on like Shudder and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, I've seen a couple of really, really great ones and looking forward to a couple that hopefully we can pick up later this year. So yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation. The information, has been wonderful. And again, I've added to my book of notes. So thank you guys.
And Dan, I'm going to give you one recommendation. If you've not seen Late Night with the Devil, I highly recommend that one. Tracy also loved it too.
I haven't heard about it. I have heard a lot of people have been talking about it. I believe the gentleman that stars in it, did he write or direct that as well?
No, he's the lead actor. He's not the director, but he's been doing a lot of horror films, and he's like you. He's a huge fan of old-time horror.
He's been on Svengoolie. I know who he is.
Yeah.
I believe he's actually a Chicago native, or he was born around Chicago. I think I'm not 100% sure on that, but I kind of know his background, but I have seen a lot of internet articles and things about that.
Yeah, the actor is David Dalmalchian, who's really good. Yeah. Everything I've seen him in has been terrific, and it's nice that he has, like us, he has an appreciation for retro horror. So he's a cool guy, and boy, at some point we'd love to have him on the show. We'll see if we can offer him enough money to do that, or something.
Fingers crossed.
Well, Dan, we really appreciate it as always. Our thanks to historian Dan Day. Dan has the blog that he writes regularly. We want to tell you about that. It's the Hitless Wonder Movie Blog. And he doesn't just write about horror films. He writes about other genres as well. Very much a fan of the Hollywood industry and films over the years. Dan will also be at Monster Bash, July 18th through the 21st. It's either in or near Mars, Pennsylvania. So if you go to that convention, which we highly recommend, make sure you look out for Dan Day. He'll be the one hanging out with the beautiful actresses and some of the old-time actors as well.
Well, I was going to say, if you want to find me, I'd be wearing my White Sox hat, but the way things are going this year, I might not do that this year. When you talk about horror or new horror films, the most horrible thing I have seen this year by far is the 2024 Chicago White Sox. You want horror? You want to see real horror?
Yes.
Poe and Lovecraft could never combine to come up with what's going on with the 2024 Chicago White Sox. So,
yeah, it's all too real. It really is. Dan, thanks a lot. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Our thanks to Dan Day, and of course, our thanks to Tracy Asteria as well. We thank all of you for listening, joining us right here in this Museum of the Macabre, and we hope to see you again next time, right here in the Ghostly Gallery.